got another little wet fly today I'm going to tie. This one's kind of interesting. Has some components to it that you don't often see in wet flies. This is called the major, by the way. It has a tip on it as well as a tag. The tag is just some blue floss. It also has a palmered hackle on it, the red hackle right here, but it has a blue throat. Often the wet flies will have a palmered hackle on them, but they won't have a throat. It's one or the other. Not often do you see both. The other thing is the wing, which is turkey, has what's called a cover on it, and that is the Gray Mallard right here. My skills at putting these covers on aren't the best in the world because I haven't done that many of them, but I think this fly turned out pretty well, and I think it represents that aspect of a wet fly pretty well. So anyway, I don't know much about the history of the major. I didn't, to be honest with you, didn't research it because I was more interested in the different steps of how this is put together. It's also a very colorful fly. Looking forward to fishing this one this next year and seeing how well it does. So that's the major, and I'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start the major by placing my hook in the vise. This is a Mustad 3399. It's a traditional wet fly hook. This is size 4. It's a little bit big for a lot of wet flies, but I want to target some of the smallmouth in my area this next year, so I'm going with a little bit bigger hook. I'm going to debarb the hook, and I'm going to attach my thread. Because this is a light purple body on this, actually even more of a lavender, I don't want to darken it up with a black thread, so I'm going to start out as a Danville 6/0 in white. I'm going to put some wax on my thread. I'll attach my thread about an eye length behind the eye of the hook and run it down this hook shank. Gives me a nice base layer of thread. And I'm going to stop just a little bit past the point of the hook. This does have a tip on it, and the tip is gold tinsel. I'm using a Danville size 14 gold tinsel. I'm going to tie that in with the silver side up. Three wraps to secure that in. Turn my hook over, and then I will put 4 wraps down the hook shank in touching turns. And then 4 wraps back up to create the tip for the major. Major does have a tail on it, and the tail is made out of golden pheasant tippet. You'll notice there is a nice bright side to these feathers, and there's also a dull side. When I cut the fibers out for my tail, I want to try and roll them together so that I have the brighter sides on the outside. So I'm going to reach in, cut, I'd say there's got to be at least 20-25 barbs in here. That's maybe about 1/8 of an inch wide. I want to try and roll those down together so that I have the brighter sides on the outside. I'm going to tie these in so that, get this one fiber out here that doesn't have any markings on it. I'm going to tie these in so that that black band is just past the bend of the hook. One thing to be careful of when you're tying this tail in, you don't want to go too far down the bend of the hook. If you're not careful, your thread and or subsequent materials can kind of push that in so that the tail's in a downward direction. I'm going to help that a little bit here by just placing one wrap of thread right at the base of the tail. It'll help just kind of prop it up and keep it propped up. One interesting thing that the Major has on it, it does have a tag as well. The tag is just blue floss. Now I'm using this stuff I got off of Amazon. Not certain what the name of it is. It's got a 54DS on the label, but it's a pure silk floss. And the primary reason I'm using it is I like the coloring of the blue better. This is a 4-strand rayon, and it's just a little bit darker than what I'm looking for. I want something that's just a little bit lighter. So I'm going to take this strand here and cut a strand out long enough so that I can fold it over twice so that I'll actually have 4 of those strands together. That way when I tie this in, I will have a tag that's thick enough that it shows up well. Now I'm not going to have this floss the length of the body. I'm not that concerned about building up too much of a bump in this area because the yarn body is going to cover that up. I want to trim the tag so it just is coming up to that black band in the tail. Now another unique thing about the Major, which is part of the reason why I chose to tie this, I was kind of challenged to tie it, is it has 2 hackles in it. It does have a palmered hackle, plus it also has a throat in it. You don't see that in a lot of wet flies, but I wanted to go ahead and give this a try. I'm using, it's a red hackle, red is what it calls for, scarlet for the palmered hackle. I'm using some strung Rooster. You could use some Schlappen if you want. One of the things you have to be careful of is if you get a feather like this, there's not a lot of shorter barbs in this here. Very quickly you're going to wrap that in and be getting into the longer fibers here. That's kind of the shape of your Schlappen a little bit more. It's much more teardrop shaped. So you end up not having a whole lot of shorter barbs in the feather. This strung Rooster, I find, often will have these feathers here where there's a long, lengthy section to it that has the shorter barbs in it. I only need 5 wraps of it, and so I'm only probably going to use about half of the feather or so, but I just don't want to get into really, really long barbs. So that's why I'm using the strung Rooster. To process the feather, I'm just going to strip away the fluff off the bottom here, but I'm going to leave all of this, even though I may not use it. I'll explain that in just a second. Holding it by the tip, I'll stroke back the barbs, leaving me just the tip of it right here to tie in. I'll trim about half that off so I have just a nice little triangle there, and I will wrap that in, not quite all the way down to where all those barbs are folded back. I'm going to leave that out just a little bit so my first wrap or so won't have any barbs going around it. The Major does have a rib on it, and I'm using the same Danville 14 gold tinsel for the rib. I go ahead and tie that in with the silver side up. I like to bring the tinsel all the way around so that it slides under the thread and it's actually on the bottom side of the hook shank. That's more just personal preference. With my rib in, now I'm ready for the body. The body on the Major calls for a purple wool or dubbing. I'm using a wool yarn. This is more of a lavender color wool yarn. It's a wool and Antron mix. I tried some dubbing. I mixed up some rabbit and Antron purple dubbing, but this was too dark for me. So I decided to go with this lighter lavender color. I think it goes better with the red and the blue in it. Now I want to trim the end of this just at a little bit of an angle. See if I can get that on screen. And that's just going to give me a little bit of a taper as that gets wound in. I'm going to set it up on top of the hook shank, and I want the end of it to be just about the end of the body. I'll secure that in, and again, this is where you want to be careful that you don't wrap too far down the hook shank, securing all that in, because we don't want to push our tail in a downward direction. A couple wraps to secure it. Put some more wax on my thread. I'll advance my thread forward. Don't have to worry about touching turns quite as much here. Again, the wool body is going to, I should say the yarn body is going to cover that up. Stop my thread about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. Now I can wrap the yarn in. This is a 4-strand yarn, and I'm going to twist this counterclockwise to kind of straighten those out. And the reason I don't want it twisted is I want it to lay flat so that it isn't too bulky. And again, that's probably more my personal preference. If you want a bulkier body, something that looks a little buggier on this, then I would go with a dubbing. Or you could add, double up on your yarn. Secure that in. Be careful not to crowd the eye on this because we do have more going on. We have a throat and a wing to tie in. Put the rib in, and you'll notice that I'm wrapping things in the opposite of how I tied them in. In other words, I tied the hackle first, then the rib, and then the body. But I'm applying the body, then the rib, then the hackle. The reason is the hackle is going to be palmered in, and that basically palmered means an open spiral, not like a collar. And it is going to follow the rib. You have to tie it in before the rib. Wrap back just a little bit here. If you can fold the barbs back, all the better, but I tend to not be too concerned about it, as you'll see when we wrap this in. Now remember, I had tied that in and left just a little bit of the rachis exposed, and that's because this first wrap here is just going to go around the back before I engage the body right here, and I just didn't want a whole lot of barbs sticking out like that. That's not bad, but they would have been sticking out straight out the back. Now I'm going to wrap this in following the forward edge of the tinsel. You can see right there, I'm just bringing the rachis along the forward edge of that tinsel. You can follow the back edge if you want, if that's more comfortable for you. But this is just palmering this in a few wraps along the tinsel. You might be tempted when you get up front here at the head to put in a collar. Don't, because you have a lot still to tie in, like I said, going on up here at the head. Trim away the excess. Now, remember I had mentioned when I processed this feather, I took the fluff off down here, but I left these longer barbs. I knew I wouldn't be using them, even though I would get close to using some of them in the front of the hackle, the palmered hackle. But the reason that I left those is I can set these aside, and if I'm tying up another wet fly or a nymph or something like that that calls for some tailing material of just some Rooster barbs or something like that. Well, I've already got it here. I've got a bunch right here that I could use for even fly this size or something smaller. So keep these little snippets around. They can come in handy. I'm going to stroke all these barbs backwards, wrapping just a few wraps in to secure them and bring my thread forward up to the eye to change over to my black thread. So we've got our tail in, our blue tag, our tip, the body, the rib, and the hackle in for the major. To finish the fly off, I'm going to use a black thread. This is a Danville 6/0 in black. The major does have a throat on it as well as a wing. The throat is simply some blue. Can't tell if that's stuck on the hook or, there we go. Some blue Schlappen is what I'm using. So I've got some blue Schlappen here, and I'm just going to pick out a nice big feather that has some long barbs on it. And I will take out some barbs from both sides of that, putting those together to make the hackles for my throat. This is where it gets kind of tricky with the major because of these hackles already in here. I'm just kind of pushing this down through the center to get the length that I'm looking for, and then I'll do my reverse pinch wrap to secure in the throat. This fly is very easy to crowd the eye and get too much of a head on this fly because there's the yarn body for one, but also there's just a lot going on with it. I'm going to smooth this area off right here for my wing. The wing on the major is kind of interesting because, as I've mentioned before, it actually has the wing and then it has a cover to the wing. As I mentioned, the wing on the major has two different components to it. There's a brown turkey that's used, and I'm again using a Ozark feather just so that it gives me more of a mottled brown. I will trim out a wide section for both the right and the left. And then I will match those together. I want to make certain that the tips are even here. That's the first thing. And then I want to make certain that they're both the same width. As you can see, the slip on my side's a little bit wider than the other, so I will peel out two or three barbs, see if I can't even that up. I think I can get one more. Nope, getting it from the wrong side, so it must be good. The length on the wing is going to be just about halfway down the tail because there's such a taper on these tips, and it's going to be cocked up a little bit. I'm going a little bit further. The other thing you want to do is you want to take your bodkin, put it down the center of the body here, and kind of push those hackles to both of the outsides. This is just going to give you a little bit of a channel for the wing, because when we put this on and the cover, those barbs can kind of get in the way. So I'll get my wing in place. I'm going to help this by pushing down on the front of that and then drawing that down to the hook. 4 or 5 wraps to secure that in. And actually that's in cockeyed a little bit, and you'll notice it all just kind of slumped right down to the eye. It's because when I first bound it in, I was closer to the eye of the hook than the back of the head. That happens. So you just want to be careful. You can always take it apart, unwrap it, and wrap it in again. Just make certain that thread's hanging where you want it. And that's a little bit better. Wing's probably a little bit narrow in regards to overall thickness of the wing, but I think that has to do with the turkey feathers themselves. Not happy with that. Third time's a charm here. We'll get this in right at the back of the head, right where I want it. There we go. And this is important because we have what's called a cover that we're going to put on the wing. And if we're too close to the eye, the cover won't go in right. So I'll trim away the excess. Making certain that I've got as much of that as I can get. I'm going to go ahead and tidy this up just a little bit with my thread right back at the back of the head here. Now the cover on this is just Gray Mallard. I had mentioned in the introduction that this is similar to another fly called the Cupsuptic. I hope I pronounced that right. That has a turkey wing and it has guinea as a cover on it. And so this is just some loose Gray Mallard that I'm using here. What I'm going to do is find my mallard feather. I'm going to take some barbs from both sides of the feather here. This is the feather I'm using. You just want to find one that has some barbs on it that are pretty straight. They're not crinkled or anything like that. And I'm just going to cut out maybe 4 or 5 from each side. Now keep in mind, these do have a curve to them depending on the side that you take them off. As you can see, my curve here, because I took these off on the left side, goes up this way. Well, I can't tie it on this side because it'll curve up. So I'm actually going to put it and tie it on the other side. And I know this you can't see because of turning the fly my way. I'm going to slide this underneath those red hackle barbs and bring this to the point where the end of it here is just up to the eye of the hook. I want the tips of that about the same length of the wing or a little bit less. But here's the important thing that I found. I want to make certain that these barbs right here are pretty much on top of the head. You would think that you would want them on the side. If you put them on the side, it's going to cause that whole slip to kind of twist out a little bit. By putting them right up on the top here, you can put in just a little pinch and loop and get those tied in, and they just stay pretty much flush right along the side. They do twist a little bit, unwrap them, and just try it again. And this, like I said, can be a rather difficult step because you've got the wing, you've got the hackles sticking out and everything, and it's just a lot going on there. to try and keep that cover nice and flush with the side of the wing. Once you get that tied in, trim away the excess. Be careful, use some nice sharp scissors. If your scissors are dull, you're going to end up pulling that, and you're going to pull that cover out of position. Now I'll cut 4 or 5 barbs from the other side. I'll do the same thing over here. You can see this a little bit better. Part of the trick is getting that in underneath those hackles. Try and turn this so you can see it. And again, notice I have these all on the top of the head. So when I pinch these on in, they just compress right down, and my cover will stay more or less flat, hopefully, along the side of the wing. Also keep in mind that if you're going to be fishing this fly, I don't think that you have to get this persnickety with the cover, because when you're fishing this, that cover and the wing are all going to get kind of beat up and flow together. There we go. They can be kind of tricky. Sometimes they go in real smooth, and sometimes they're just a little more finicky. Again, these are going to be fishing flies for me, so I'm not going to worry about it that much. I just want to try and represent a little bit better of what you're looking for when you tie this in. The other thing is, you can get sometimes those red hackle fibers will get up underneath it, and it doesn't lay nice and smooth along the wing. Okay, that one's in well enough. I haven't tied a whole lot of wet flies that have these in them, so my skill set isn't the best in the world, but I think this will represent pretty well. So with that tied in, we'll tidy up the head just a little bit, try to cover some things up. Careful not to make the head too big. I'm going to put some black lacquer on this, so if I've got a few pieces like this that aren't covered up, I want to make certain I don't get too big of a head on here. Counterspin that and put in, I'll flatten my thread here, and I'll put in about a 9 or 10 turn whip finish. A lot of times your whip finish will actually cover up the last remnants of any materials or anything. Trim away my thread, and just a little bit of head cement here on both sides. Yeah, I've got what's going on your side is the red hackle fibers are actually pushing that cover up a little bit. And I'll come back in a moment and put a couple coats of black lacquer on that to complete it. So that's the major. Like I said, it's an interesting fly. I don't know much about it in terms of its history or anything, but I enjoyed it because of the different materials in this. You don't find a lot of them, wet flies, that have a tip and tag on them, as well as the palmered hackle. There's a number of wet flies that have palmered hackles, but they generally don't have a throat in them as well, but this one does. And then the only two flies that I know of, and I'm certain that there are more, that have a cover on them is this one and the cup septic, like I mentioned before. It's a fun fly to tie. Be interesting to see how well it fishes. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.